evening, everyone. My name is Heather Ellsworth, and this assignment is for History 530 American Christian Heritage Week 2 video discussion. For my discussion, I decided to research Mary Dyer, which, interesting enough, I honestly didn't really know a lot about before this discussion, and I found out that I actually have very similar beliefs and viewpoints, and I've kind of ranked her up there with female figures I should kind of emulate in my life. So a little bit of background on Mary. She was born in the early 1600s in England, later marrying a hat maker by the name of William Dyer. 2 years after they got married, they decided to travel to America, and that is really where her story gets interesting. She befriended Anne Hutchinson, and kind of together they took part in the antinomian controversy, which was a religious and political conflict in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636 to 1638. What I found really interesting about this is them being an organization of women and men that studied the Bible for themselves. This belief went against a Puritan minister's belief by the name of John Cotton, who really believed in a covenant of works, and that is how you would get into heaven, where the Society of Friends, this missionary work for the Quakers, really believed in a covenant of grace and having to have a personal divine experience with God in order to be considered saved. And I find even today in the 21st century, we still have Christian believers arguing over this covenant of works versus this covenant of grace. And I really kind of like how Mary, a female, was at the heart of all of this movement in the early 1600s. Another thing that I honestly found really interesting about Mary was in this article how she's considered monster to martyr, all because of a stillbirth that she had in October of 1637. I myself, I think, found this connection with Mary because unfortunately my husband and I have also faced miscarriages, and it kind of just made Mary a little bit more human to me, being that we shared this experience. And when she suffered her miscarriage, since the baby was deformed, Governor Winthrop used this as evidence to exhume the stillbirth's body and continue to use the baby's body and Mary's experience through this miscarriage as an example of a punishment from God for the errors of the animism movement. And being that I'm a firm believer that God does not use children as punishment, this really stuck with me and kind of went against what I had thought about in the past about John Cotton, and just kind of changed my opinion of him a lot. Continuing on to kind of talk about what her experience was after this exhuming of her baby's body. She became a Quaker and really kind of went against this laws of toleration that you could not be anything other than a Puritan in New England at this time period. Her first trial in 1652 resulted in her banishment, to which her and her husband later moved back to England for quite a while. Upon returning to the colonies in 1658, she was once again arrested and expelled from the colony of Massachusetts in Boston. In the same year, ironically, she was once again arrested and banished from New Haven, Connecticut. And then finally, kind of setting an example of her in May 31st of 1660, she was sentenced to death. and actually the very next day hung in the Boston Commons. I think that Mary Dyer leaves behind a huge legacy. I find it interesting that her death was used as a scare tactic, when really she is a huge martyr for religious freedom. There are several bronze statues of her that were designed by a Quaker sculptor, Sylvia Shaw Judson. The original one is in the state capitol of Massachusetts in Boston. There's a copy of it at the Friends Center in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and another one at the Stout Meeting House in Earlham, in the Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana. I truly think that being a person that is not talked about a lot in history, but is truly a martyr for religious freedom and is an excellent example of why we actually need separation of church and state in America. She is truly a forgotten figure in women's resistance for religious freedom. She encouraged women and Quakers, and honestly is probably the first or one of the first American colonial feminists. And I want to emulate her desire to serve God someday. I hope you enjoyed my presentation on Mary Dyer. Have a good night.